Warm welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on why Jahmelia can't read or write, government failures and the reading wars. My name is Gorana Henry and I'm a primary PGC program leader and primary and early years initial teacher education lead at the IOE UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. And I'm so delighted to be chairing today's lecture, which I know will have both personal and professional significance to all of you joining us today. So a bit of my background. Prior to my current role at the IOE, I was a senior leader in a primary school and very much involved in decision-making around how to approach the teaching of phonics, reading and writing across particularly 2021-22 academic years when the DfE released guidance on the criteria for the teaching of systematic synthetic phonics. And I remember well some of the tensions as well as financial considerations that many of you, I'm sure, are still considering or may be considering as you listen to today's lecture. So it's my absolute honor to introduce today's speakers. We have Prof Wyse and Charlotte Hacking. Prof Wyse is Professor of Early Childhood and Primary Education at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. The main focus of Prof.'s research is curriculum and pedagogy, which includes a sustained contribution to knowledge about teaching writing, reading, and creativity. Charlotte Hacking is Director of Learning and Programs at the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education, and you may know it better as CLPE. Charlotte's special interests lie in early years, early reading development, the development of writing, and the use of picture books and poetry to raise children's engagement and attainment. And just before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we very much are inviting you to be curious during this lecture, and we'll have some time at the end of the lecture for questions. And the way that you can submit these is at any point during Prof and Charlotte's talk by going to Slido, so that's SLI.do. You can just enter that into your internet browser and entering the event code, which is #reading wars. So just to repeat, Slido, SLI.do, and you'll be prompted to enter an event code, which is #reading wars, one word. So I will now hand over to Prof for his talk.
Thanks very much, Gorana. I'll just get the slides up and running and just checking that you can see that first slide there. I presume everyone can, and so I will start the lecture today. Thank you all so much for attending this. We really appreciate the interest. There were more than 200 people registered, and we're really grateful that people share some of our interests and concerns and indeed potential solutions. So we have the title, Why Jahmelia Can't Read. That's an echo of an infamous text in the United States called Why Johnny Can't Read in 1955. And it caused considerable reaction and a lurch towards, yes, systematic phonics or synthetic phonics. And the complaint being that not enough phonics was being done. So I'm not going to say much today about history of these kind of debates. I have done that in other publications, but it's worth remembering that, I think, for lots of people, perhaps particularly our new political leaders in the future. I lead the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, a research centre devoted to improving pedagogy for young children. So let me begin with what I'm calling true stories, ? As you can see, I have a quote here from a recent talk by Rishi Sunak, saying that kids in England are the best readers in the Western world, and saying that his party and his government changed how we teach our kids, and all of that has worked. And this is linked to a report from one of these international comparative studies called Pearls. And you can see that the Telegraph gloss this by saying that Mr. Sunak says the UK was plummeting in league tables in 2010, but is now marching up those international league tables. Well, let's have a look at, very briefly, I just want to have a quick look at some of the data. Oh, yes, by the way, the phrase, I'm always interested in how phrases come about. As far as I can tell, the idea of the best in the West was around in the Daily Telegraph in 2023. So this particular graph, I'm not going to go into detail on this one because I've got another one which removes that cliff edge. And that cliff edge is COVID, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It really looks dramatic. And of course, there's a clear example of how when education is disrupted, it really does have an impact on children and young people. But let's look at just a little bit more detail on this briefly. You remember the claim that, England is at the top of the charts, as it were. Well, if we start to look more carefully, I mean, the obvious thing straight away is that there are at least 2 countries or regions higher, and this is just pearls. I'm going to come to PISA in a moment. You can see Ireland actually has the highest score in the PISA ranking. Northern Ireland's there. Another interesting phenomenon here is the way that Australia climbed between 2011 and 2016. Subsequently has lurched towards synthetic phonics, actually, following a visit from Nick Gibb MP. We cover that in our book. But actually identifying which policies may have influenced these trends is really complicated. Let me just turn now to PISA. I tend to regard PISA as perhaps more important than pearls because this is when pupils are tested when they're 15, they're age 15. And so you've got a longer longitudinal element. We have many more years of data collection or periods of data collection to consider. And now, again, you can see that England is clustered in the lower end of the countries that I've chosen to focus on today. And indeed, right at the top there is Canada. And Canada and then Ireland. And they're 2 countries that I might make more reference to in the talk. But for now, important to say that they're, just in basic terms, that they are scoring higher than England. So any claims about England's performance must be carefully weighed up against what other comparable regions and countries are doing. And a thing that was not mentioned in any of the media reporting, I commented this on the 3-series IOE blog post I did all about the reaction to the Pearls 2021 scores. Well, rather importantly, Pearls also surveys how much pupils like reading. And you can see here I've drawn out some of the percentages. And England's pupils rank 42nd out of 65. 65 is the total number of countries where pupils were surveyed for their interest in reading, their motivation for reading. And I think it's certainly true to say that nearly everyone who cares about children and their reading really wants them to be motivated. I have an important statistic to add later in terms of motivation when I show you our new model. Continuing my theme of true stories, a different minister quoting this time, this was indeed Nick Gibb MP, who said, "Our obsession with phonics has worked." That's an obsession is something that obviously carries with it not necessarily positive connotations. Okay, so let's see what does obsession look like if it becomes played out in government policies for education. So I've estimated that if we assume an hour of synthetic phonics per day, there is some debate about that, but we're going to assume that for now. That means that 15% of the whole curriculum for children in years 1 and 2, or who are between the ages of 6 and 7, 15% of their whole curriculum not even devoted to the whole of reading, devoted to one small but important slice of reading. We also have, since 2012, the imposition of the phonics screening check, where all 6-year-olds in England are tested for whether they can read real words and also pseudo words, or what some people call nonsense words. Another aspect of what obsession looks like in education policies is this quote. Now, another new thing that's happened is that the DfE now validate, vet, and approve commercial synthetic phonics schemes. And this is a quote from the criteria. It's in a note. And actually, it turns out that this particular quote is important because worldwide, there is an idea at the moment that if you teach children what's called guessing, it's not simple guessing, by the way, that if you encourage children to guess, that's bad, and it's not informed by research, people say. And so they say what they should focus on first and foremost is the phonemes and the letters. Now, we can find lots of research that shows that that is not appropriate. I'm only citing one study today, actually seminal work, I think in about 1990. And Cunningham did an experimental trial where she directly compared what happens if you encourage children to use what we call semantic clues or cues, and also things like grammar when they're trying to work out a word they're not sure of. And in fact, it was shown that it was more effective. So if you encourage children to guess, like intelligently guess, it's better than the quote from the policy suggests. And in our book, we identify 7 major policy levers that have been used and that we say is part of this obsession. Well, I had a quick look at some of the international comparative data, but how about closer to home? Okay, you know, as you may well know, we have a battery of statutory assessments and tests in England. So the phonics screening check, which, by the way, we know this from research on curriculum, that if you have a high stakes test, it distorts the curriculum, or it can do. We would argue this certainly has. It's one of the most powerful levers to force change. But even though for more than a decade we've had an intense and increasing focus on synthetic phonics, 21% of children, when assessed in 2023, did not meet the expected standard. 21%, even in the thing that has been the biggest priority of all. You can see below that on the, actually, in my view, rather more important assessments, particularly teachers' assessment of reading, particularly teachers' assessment of writing, 32% and 40% of children not meeting the expected standard. And so when we did quite a lot of the work in a previous paper, we looked very carefully at the statistics around international comparative studies. We actually concluded that it's so difficult to attribute a particular policy. If I just add one detail, of course, you have to track back to when did a policy actually start? And then you also need to know, you need to, I think, assess it before it's been in place for a very long time, because there are effects that happen related to teaching to the test. Knowing when a policy is actually embedded is not straightforward. And so for lots and lots of reasons, and indeed lots of statistical reasons around looking at the Pearls and PISA reports, we concluded that actually what we really need to pay attention to is, you know, what does the most robust research say about the best ways to teach reading and writing, as I will emphasize more and more. Now, particularly in the USA, this concept of the science of reading, it's become a real sort of buzzword and is usually quickly associated with narrow synthetic phonics, and the idea that if you do narrow synthetic phonics, that will have a massive effect, is claimed, on helping young children to read better. But my reading of the science of reading and the reactions to it is it's not even looking really at the science of reading. And so I'm only going to give a few examples here. You can see on the slide. So even if we begin with systematic reviews, tertiary reviews, so these are robust studies published in peer-reviewed research journals, typically. There are now, I've put there 3 of 24. Well, I've found 24, but there are more. But these are all covering, if not scores of studies, sometimes hundreds of studies. Just to give an example, so the tertiary review by Carol Torgerson and colleagues, published in 2018, found that many studies, so in other words, of the effective interventions that they located through the systematic searching, in most interventions, the studies added phonics to whole language approaches, which by some people think that whole language approaches are completely useless. But overall, they said what they call balanced instruction is indicated. If we take struggling readers, the systematic review by Russell Gersten and colleagues, I focus in here on the final sentence that interventions that included writing resulted in higher effect sizes. But overall, what we're finding is multi-component approaches are what's needed. And it's possible that many teachers will say, well, yes, that's what I would have assumed, because when I'm actually teaching, undue separation doesn't really work. And then finally, on this slide, the Sebastian Suggert systematic review, which I regard as particularly important because it was one of the few systematic reviews to focus only on longitudinal studies, i.e. that included post-testing at least 11 months after the end of the intervention had finished, and found that phonics interventions that included a comprehension component, that means reading comprehension component, were more effective than those that did not. In the 2022 paper, Alice Bradbury and I also looked in detail at what was actually happening in these effective single studies that were covered in the systematic reviews. Here's one just to give an example. And I give this example because lots of people kind of say, well, some people say, it's quite clear from the science of reading that synthetic phonics is the only way. And why would you ever say anything else? But if you actually look at the detail of how these studies, what were the interventions? What were the teachers doing? What were the pupils experiencing? What was the philosophy? So here's one that was one of the very effective interventions. And there were booklets that supported this intervention. What were they like? Well, these booklets were thematic and they contained familiar topics to increase the child's expectation that text should make sense. So there was an emphasis on making meaning, making sense. There was not an emphasis on a narrow slice of working particularly on learning phonemes, although that work was done. There was also a strong fit between the illustrations and the text to develop the concept that both text and picture frame the meaning. Very rare do you hear people advocating for synthetic phonics saying, well, actually, in terms of meaning, we do need to consider the way that illustrations work in young children's books. So now I'm going to turn away from the snapshot of empirical studies to consider another area that's vital to how we might know what's likely to work on the basis of research and theory. There are some very good models, very influential models. Perhaps this is one of the most influential, the simple view of reading. Reading equals decoding and comprehension, language comprehension. But I want to highlight something here. If you go back to the original paper by Philip Goff and Sumner, they were quite clear that this was not about teaching. We begin by noting the issue we wish to discuss is not that of the place of decoding in reading instruction. They recognized it was important, but that was not the main focus of the work they did. And another model that is also popular, in fact, perhaps a bit more popular with teachers. I've come across teachers in England mentioning this, the reading rope, but also actually it's cited in a report in Ontario, Canada, that fed into a lurch towards synthetic phonics there. But you can see that this, although the strands of the rope do join up, there is a clear separation in language comprehension and word recognition, which is quite similar to how it was framed in the simple view of reading by Gough and Tumner. Well, we think that although those models do have some really very helpful aspects, it's time that we moved on and had models that most of all are models of teaching, not models of learning. So as Charlotte and I worked on the book and the paper, we were thinking about, well, what are the principles, if you like, the philosophies that underpin the approach that we've developed. And eventually we created this new model, including its visual representation as perhaps the most human of things, the DNA. So this has been published in the peer-reviewed journal Literacy this month, and we have obviously a longer account in the chapter in the book that goes through previous models and explains in more practical detail how our model works. I'm just going to give you a flavour, if I can, of why we think it's important. So what's important is the fact that the child, we begin with the child and their language or languages. And that's not some sort of, simple progressivism. This is about genuinely thinking, each child is bringing something unique to the learning environment. And as teachers, we do need to understand as much as we can and tailor our teaching to support each individual child as best we can. Another key surrounding function of our model is the environment that children are brought up in, that they experience, but particularly texts. And texts exist in many, many forms, including the debates around digital texts, including texts in the environment and food packaging, you name it, but also, of course, books. And the other thing about our models, it's not just about reading. Most of the influential models that we track in the book have been either about reading or about writing, but we've found that the evidence has simply grown and grown, that if you want to teach children to read effectively, then you need to include writing and vice versa. And this is just two. We've found, I think it's 4 systematic reviews. I think Steve Graham was involved in all of them. He's done incredible work on what works in the teaching of writing. But, we need models that account for both reading and writing. So let's look at some of the details. So right in the heart of the model, in the heart of our theory is the task of making meaning. But perhaps even more important than that is, are we motivating children to read? Not for the future, from the beginning. Do we engage them? Do we try and motivate them? And how do we do that? Now, why should we do that? Well, this seminal study from 1984 has that alarming statistic that the least motivated children might read on average 100,000 words per year, whereas children with average motivation might read 1 million words per year. Now, you probably are aware of this concept of the Matthew effect, or the rich get richer type thing applied to reading. It really does. Motivation isn't just some nice add-on. It really, really matters, and you'll get better outcomes if you do it. Phonological awareness is massively important, it's the foundation for even beginning to teach phonics. We've known about this for a long time. Usha Goswami and Peter Bryant's seminal work about the importance, of larger units preceding understanding of smaller units. and indeed for phonological awareness, needs to be a whole language environment. So now you see, finally in the model, we do actually get to the importance of phonemes, letters, morphemes. So we've never said that systematic phonics teaching isn't important. It is important, but it's become way out of balance, as I hope the policy levers that I showed you would indicate. So I've posed a little question there. If it was, if we had interaction, I might pause and I sometimes get people to guess, you know, how many ways do words in the English language make the oo phoneme? And you may have had a quick think about that. So fascinating paper that is not even available digitally. I had to go back and contact the authors in fact, the editor in Canada. And you can see some words there that you might think, well, they're not terribly common, but nevertheless, they're part of the language. And they're in dictionaries. The researcher used dictionaries at the time to identify words. So that's 38 different ways in relatively common words. And this, Nick Nikos then predicted a total of 1,120 graphemes, which in that study they applied to 40 speech sounds or phonemes. Why am I saying that? Well, because it really is impossible, I would say, and not desirable to teach children every single phoneme. Don't think anybody advocates that, but it's the complexity. And so we have the self-teaching hypothesis, which says if you teach enough, then children self-learn. And I think we've underestimated children's ability to self-learn. So that sort of concludes my start to the lecture. And I'm going to hand over to Charlotte now, and hopefully this will all work smoothly.
Thank you very much, Dom. Just as a little bit of my background, I've been involved in primary education for over 25 years now, both as a teacher, a school leader and a teacher trainer, but I now work for CLPE, and we are an independent charity that's worked with primary schools around the country and beyond. And what we do is support them in developing best practice in all aspects of literacy teaching. And CLP has now done that for over 50 years. At the heart of our centre in London, which you can see on the screen here, is a library of over 23,000 children's books. And that's because quality literature lies at the heart of our research programmes, our professional development programmes for teachers, and the extensive suite of resources, including online resources that we provide for schools. And that's because at CLP, we're really keen advocates of making the best quality children's books an integral part of the primary experience and provision. And that is really also what lies at the heart of our balanced approach, and what I've been bringing in terms of that from CLPE's extensive research base. And that lies at the double helix model. Reading and writing are really focused on the search for and the communication of meaning, and it's fostered by the motivation of rich texts that are written by the best children's authors, illustrators and poets. As Dom said, you know, we are advocates of phonics done in the right way, but what we are advocating is that balance between teaching that's based on the use of whole text, systematic teaching about that alphabetic code, but also putting that into the context of other linguistic features as well. It's about that central focus on comprehending the meaning of written language, but balancing that with the acquisition of a range of skills and knowledge. We're making those explicit links between phonics teaching and those other linguistic aspects. That's often with a combination of real books and reading scheme books with controlled vocabularies. And that's what we're going to demonstrate in the next part of this. Well, we know from a wealth of research, including some longitudinal studies by Iram Siraj, that children who succeed against the odds are those that have got real rich reading experiences, and are those that have enabling adults around them that can engage in talk, play and engaging experiences. Sharing a book with children is one of the most important things that we can do in building that sense of motivation and therefore reading for pleasure. It not only supports children in engaging with a given book, in learning to read and in sharing responses, but it undeniably strengthens the bonds between adult and child. That's an essential part of learning to read, of which bedtime reading routines also form a part of. And we know that children who read at home and who are read to at home and read with at home and who read for pleasure are much more likely to succeed against the odds, increasing both their academic achievement and their life chances. Sharing books and stories together provides opportunities to just be together, to recognise and value how children engage with the story and the illustrations that are often part of those early books that you'll share with children as well. To look and talk together about what characters are doing, what they're feeling, to explore emotions and feelings and encourage empathy, to enhance children's imagination and their creativity, to extend their vocabulary and language, including that really vital story language that gives them the building blocks of narrative. It's also about looking at how books work by turning pages, pointing to words, using the pictures, but most importantly, to develop that lifelong love of books and reading. Now, when we're working with children, we also need to be aware of the children who don't have books in their home, the ones who don't get read to often and who don't get routines like being taken to the library or being read a bedtime story, because those are the children that we're really going to need to concentrate our efforts on in school if we're going to close those equality and attainment gaps that Dom looked at in the data earlier. Developing reader identity is a key part of this. Children need to be able to see themselves in the books that we're reading. So sharing, reading, talking about books should happen on a daily basis, and we should be carefully considering the books that we choose to use with children. In schools, in homes, in libraries, and in our bookshops, children need to meet text with characters that look like them, sound like them, and have the same interests and experiences. And our Reflecting Realities research at CLPE has been really unpicking whether there are enough books in the market for all of our children to be able to do this. And what we found when we started this research 7 years ago is that there weren't a wide enough range of diverse and representative characters where all children were enabled to do this. What we've seen over the course of the 7 years is that real shift in the publishing industry with better output and better text that allow our children to be seen in literature and to see themselves. Now, the books in which we provide for our children in their most formative years should be those texts that allow them to see that literacy and literature is a place and a space for anyone, that there's no language, no cultural, no class hierarchy, and that everybody's experiences, interests, and contexts are valid as others. The unique connections that children make with their favourite books, rhymes and songs, the ones that they really take to heart and want to read and enjoy over and over again, are really formative in their attitudes and engagement with reading, but also their motivation later for writing as well. And that's why reading aloud to and reading with children is key, and why that bedtime story cycle is a crucial experience for children. Our approach really aims to connect phonics, reading and writing. So in the second half of the book, we actually look at what this looks like in action. We talk about the time spent on phonics. We think no more than 30 minutes a day for phonics lessons, but they're not just phonics lessons. They are lessons that incorporate whole literacy teaching, where we're introducing real books, we're connecting children with texts, we're teaching those key word reading skills and strategies, including the letter phoneme correspondences and the skills of segmenting and blending. All of the activity leads to purposeful literacy activity, encouraging children to speak, to listen, to read, to write for a range of purposes and audiences, and that learning moves progressively from teaching children the basic code to the complex code and investigating more widely how words can be structured. So sessions are carefully planned around real books that allow children's knowledge about phonics, language, reading and writing to build progressively. And in the programme of phonics teaching, children will be moving from learning that letters represent sounds, as you can see here, And in the next example, that sometimes more than one letter can represent a single sound. And in the final example that we see here, that there are multiple ways of representing a single sound using a variety of letter combinations. And also that some of these letters can represent different sounds when they're seen in different words. Now, planning that cohesive teaching of phonics, language, reading and writing through these real books has the potential to effectively bring to children a really clear understanding of what being literate entails. That exposure to book language provides opportunities to experience words and sentences that are rarely encountered in conversations. And those things start early in life. They're evident in the books children hear in the context of shared reading. From infancy onwards, children need to have the ability to learn from that kind of input. That establishes the foundations for more advanced language development as well as literacy, and also counteracts those the distribution of attainment that will become evident in their adult life. Now, in sessions based around quality texts such as these, language is going to underpin children's reading and writing. Reading is geared to foster their writing, but also writing supports the development of children's reading, particularly when they're reading their own writing back to themselves. The teaching of knowledge and skills is really carefully balanced with fostering engagement and motivation. And activities are going to be planned in the wider provision that stimulate talk, play, and imagination and enrich children's language and literacy. Could we just go back to the last slide, please, Dom? Sorry. I'm just going to read the first page of Stanley Stick by Neil Layton and John Hegley to you now, which reads, Stanley stands on Stockport Station with his stick. Stanley always carries his stick with him. Now, obviously here, there is a focus on the phoneme S represented by the letter S. The rich language of a poet, John Hegley, who's written this, focuses on the tunes of alliterative language and allows for that. But this text also centres around a very real and everyday experience that any child can easily relate to. A child having a special stick and engaging in imaginary play and real-world experience with it. We can gain a picture of children's prior learning and experiences. We might ask them who's been on a train before, where were they going, who were they going with? Have they ever been to Stockport like Stanley is? Do they know where it is? Do they know anyone who lives there? But also we can gauge their understanding of the situation that Stanley finds himself in at the opening of this story. We might ask them what they know or what they think they know about him. Why might he have his stick with him? What's the importance of calling it his stick? Not just Stanley stands on Stockport Station with a stick or the stick, it's his stick. Why is that word choice important? Who might he be with? Where might they be going? What makes you think that? What else is going on in the picture? Who else is at the station and what are they doing? There's a wealth of talk and opportunity around this. And as we look at the next example, we can see that extended activity planned around the text supports then children to consolidate the language and the concepts and develop their wider literacy skills. Responding to the text and illustration and planning in a variety of questions like we just explored around these helps children to develop retrieval, inference, deduction and empathy, drawing on what can be seen in the pictures and the story. The stick activity that we can see in this spread leads us not only to another letter phoneme correspondence, the A phoneme represented by the letter A, but also leads us to the kinds of activity that children can engage with in terms of exploratory and imaginative play with sticks themselves. And as we can see in the next examples, we can see lots of examples of children engaging in this kind of play-based formative activity that allows them to communicate, to engage in sustained shared thinking, and to also create writing for a range of purposes and audiences. You can see a nursery child here doing weaving with sticks, developing the fine motor skills in terms of handling objects that are going to lead to writing. These reception children that you can see here burnt wood. They looked at the changes that happened. They used the charcoal to provide observational drawings of sticks. In the next example, you can see children who've gone and found sticks for themselves and engaged in their own stick activities, describing the activities they did and engaging in play together. And in the final activity, you can see how purposeful writing opportunities are helping children to develop both compositional aspects of writing whilst they practice the early transcriptional elements as well. And that's all planned as part of the lessons that are stimulated by and extended from the text. What we want is for children to use and apply their phonic knowledge, but also wider writing knowledge and skills independently in self-directed and self-created writing. Phonics teaching is a vital part of this approach, but it's really balanced with all of the other elements of reading and writing, so that as well as developing the skills to decode and encode words, they never lose sight of the fact that reading and writing are driven by meaning and motivation. Now, in many phonics sessions taught using the more narrow approaches or from very highly published schemes, children are discouraged from drawing on pictures cues, or they centre around texts that have limited vocabularies, shallow storylines, and illustrations which merely complement the text on the page rather than taking children beyond this. If we look inside this book now, we'll see that books like this that have the simple text, a fun den, a big hug, they're not going to be the books that, as Kathy Nutt-Brown said, would light the flame of a love of literature that will burn and burn throughout children's lives. What we need to be clear on is that these books are a scaffold, they're a crutch for children to practice very narrow and very specific skills that are part of children learning to read, and we should be using them as such. We can draw on these around the high quality texts like Stanley's Stick for specific children who need to practice more discreetly letter phoneme recognition and the skills of blending and segmenting. And as much as we can, if we can provide texts like this that extend on and build ideas around the text, for example, using sticks here to build a fun den together, will bring that language together, but in a very fine and practiced way for children who specifically need it. These are also not the books that are going to fill children with rich language, vocabulary, and concepts that will feed their imagination as writers. Books like you see on the screen here are. The other word that I think we're hearing a lot about at the moment is oracy. We've got this now perceived concern around children's language and ability to articulate and communicate effectively. And one of the questions I also think we need to be asking ourselves at this time is, do we have adequate time in an overstuffed curriculum with more directed teaching than ever to plan for talk to happen, to model how to talk for different purposes and audiences, to draw on resources and use approaches that develop children's language, critical and creative thinking, and to ensure that talk is both a process for and a product for learning. Because real books like this, like you see on the screen here, and rich experiences, as you see in the next example, that are going to allow children to play out language and play out concepts in action, to engage in talk, to engage in discussion with enabling adults, to engage in play and sustain shared thinking. They will do this, and they will empower children with the language, the ideas, and the motivation to write for themselves in a range of different contexts, for a range of different purposes, and a range of different audiences in a range of forms. You can see Molly and Matilda here are able to use and apply that phonic knowledge in action, writing things that can be read unmediated by an adult, drawing on the rich language and rich experiences. They're not limiting themselves to phonetically decodable sentences that they could write accurately. They're going beyond that. They're drawing on their phonic knowledge to write the things that they really want to write, to communicate what they've learned about frogs to an audience of their own. So to draw this together, what we need to be successful are teachers who are really knowledgeable about children's literature, teachers who know how to choose and use books to be able to draw out the opportunities for phonics, reading, writing, and talk throughout a range of different reading experiences, teaching children how to use and apply reading knowledge, skills, and strategies. We need that ethos, that environment that encourages, enthuses, inspires, and excites children, but also that values reading and writing and values children's ability to read and write. We've got to have that drive to create the community of readers and writers with opportunities to share our responses, our opinions, our motivations. And we have to have access to the high quality texts such as those we've seen today, the ones that have the depth and interest in story, character, illustration, vocabulary, structure, and subject matter. A read aloud programme is a really important part of this. What we need to remember, as Jim Trelease draws on in his Read Aloud handbook, is that children's reading comprehension doesn't catch up to their listening comprehension till about the age of 12 or 13. So throughout primary, a read aloud programme to support children's listening comprehension is crucial. We also need the opportunities to talk and discuss books and stories with the appropriate structures provided to do that, and opportunities to engage in a range of authentic contexts and purposes for writing, working with authors and illustrators to really understand the process of how we create writing in the real world. That is what our approach aims to achieve, and that's what we want to see in the early years classrooms of today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Charlotte, as ever. Just while people gather their thoughts to pose some questions, and Garana, I think you're going to help us with this. Just here, just a few of the things that are going on in relation to the book, the paper, the work we've done, our approach. We're incredibly grateful that organisations around the world are reaching out to us and inviting us to speak online. I've highlighted in the middle there the 2nd of July event, where we will do the, I say formal book launch, but it'll be both formal and informal, preceded by a webinar, which we've got 7 different speakers, I think, altogether. We've got people from the USA, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and of course Charlotte and I will launch the book. So I'm afraid we already have a waiting list. It kind of people took up the opportunity very quickly, which is fantastic. We've got a waiting list for the physical launch, but of course there's lots of room, endless room, almost infinite room for the hybrid webinar part of that event on the 2nd of July. The physical bit will happen at the wonderful CLP, and we'll be in that very room, I believe, Charlotte, where the library and all the thousands of books are.
We will indeed.
Thanks so much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Garana, and I shall stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dom and Charlotte. Gosh, what you're providing us with is really just rich. I think we've got the theory and a new model of teaching, but crucially, we've also got the practical, the practice. You know, what does it look like in practice? And Charlotte, was really lovely just to kind of see how rich those texts are and how this kind of the stimuli that get pulled through into you know, all the areas of the curriculum. And what's coming through really strongly are 3 things for me: balance, meaning, and motivation. You know, both of you talked about them, and just seeing kind of how the text translate into children's learning is quite special. So you're building on the analysis of a range of models, you're systematically connecting the individual components, and you're presenting us with a rationale for new pedagogy, which is quite exciting. So I'm going to go to some questions now. Okay. So we've got, how do you see the place of writing in relation to the reading debates? And perhaps, Dom, if we start with you there.
Okay, yeah. I think the big problem has been the lack of attention to writing at all as part of the reading debates. And the reading debates, of course, from time to time rage furiously in the media. And that's no inconsequential thing. I mean, I understand that the Sold a Story podcasts in the USA were the 2nd most downloaded Apple podcast, which is extraordinary for a set of 6 podcasts about the teaching of reading. But apparently that particular journalist and her team have had strong impacts and legal impacts on how teachers teach. But it's all about reading. And so, number one, we need just much more attention to writing generally, but also, as we said, you know, and we gave examples, there's solid, very solid research evidence showing that you need to, in order to improve reading, you need to systematically plan for writing as part of the reading teaching and vice versa. So that would be my opening remark on that one.
Brilliant, thank you. Charlotte, anything to add, or shall I move on?
I absolutely agree with that, and it's a kind of, it's a misplaced thing just looking at one thing discreetly. I think one of the worst things that came um, in the aftermath of the Rose Review was this idea of a discrete phonics session, because phonics is anything but discrete. It's part of reading, but it's part of writing as well. And children, particularly in the early years, learn much about their reading skills through the writing that they create and want to read back for themselves. They're really invested in what they've self-produced, and that teaches them much about how to interrelate those skills. And that's why the double helix model has been so important for us, showing the interrelation of that. And it carries on as children grow. I mean, much of the research at CLPE is grounded on The Reader and the Writer by Val Cork and Myra Bars, and understanding that the lessons that we learn from our writing come from our reading, but also that, again, writing, the ideas that we have about writing can feed back into our reading and our idea of reader response as well.
Thank you so much. Just moving on from that, if schools are thinking about adjusting their practices for teaching reading and writing, what are some of the important things to do first? And Charlotte, if I might come to you with this as well, and because I know that CLPE kind of does have a range of sort of CPD opportunities as well, which is, something schools will have to think about. So yeah, if schools are thinking about adjusting practices, where to start?
Yeah, I mean, adjusting practices is going to take time. And let's be quite frank, we're in election season at the minute. It's going to take a shift in the assessment, it's going to take a shift in the curriculum, and it's going to take a shift in the inspection regime. At the moment, all of those things are narrowing schools towards this validated programs, very discrete, this very narrow approach. So to open this up more fully, we need a change of direction there. However, this is doable within normal practice, and we have a 2-day phonics course at the CLP that shows teachers how to do more of the use and application of those very narrow and discrete phonics skills into children's reading and writing, grounded in the high quality text that you see there. The text examples that are in the book are all drawn from the programs that we have at CLPE and are all grounded in the research around that. At the minute, you do have to play the game with the phonics sessions. We also wholeheartedly believe in the use of phonics. It's that taking it from the discrete to the contextualized, showing children that phonics is a key part of helping them to read anything they want to read and write anything they want to write. Now, I pulled out the differences between those decodable texts and the real rich text that we're talking about. Schools are going to have those decodable books in place as the crutch, as the scaffold, but we need to be looking beyond those. Who are the children who are ready to move on from that, who are ready to look at richer books in the group reading experiences and the read aloud experiences that we give them? We want those books to fill the book corners, to go home along with a scheme book or a decodable reader in a book bag for those rich homeschool experiences. It's making sure that I think you used the right words, it's breadth, it's balance, it's making learning contextualized and cohesive and driving that motivation and meaning. It's thinking about which are the books and the writing experiences that are going to motivate children, and how do we incorporate those alongside until we get the kind of review we need to be bolder. Dom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, yeah, brilliant. Just a bit about the politics. I mean, we're at a point in time when the electorate will choose. We have some parties who are advocating for change in the national curriculum, and we have some parties that are not. So I think, people will need to consider that carefully. But what I would like to say also is to try and reassure. I'm aware that there's some teachers sort of feel, oh no, not whole scale change yet again. We're dealing with, and they are dealing with a lot. Our other work in the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, for example, has looked into things like food banks and the tremendous additional social role that schools are playing. But actually, we advocate not revolution, evolution. And I think there are some profound but smallish changes that could be made to the existing national curriculum and some of the guidance. That's also important. that could be done over quite a considerable timescale. I want to say again, I want to advocate the approach that Ireland is taking. I mean, I do have a slight vested interest. I'm one of the 4 academic advisors to the curriculum authority there. But I genuinely feel that the way they're approaching this, they started revising their national curriculum in 2020. It had been in place since 1999, apart from a few important additions. And they are really taking their time. They're consulting seriously. It's research informed from the start, and not just the academic advisors. They commissioned a number of pieces of research. They've done an incredible panel study of young children's views about their curriculum. That's the way to go. I would say to any politician who wants to see a different way of doing things, go and talk to people in the Republic of Ireland.
I think the key things as well, it's not necessarily a shift. It's giving teachers back license, and it's giving teachers back autonomy and the knowledge to be able to do those things. The CPD, Ofsted pulled out in their recent subject knowledge report that, you know, whilst teachers were very tuned into teaching phonics, no surprise there because we've had such a focus on it, they were less confident in fluency and comprehension. Well, no surprise there because we've taken that away in the way that we're saying it like Dom says, it's not seismic shifts, it's those little changes that bring back license, autonomy, and teachers having the knowledge to make those decisions for themselves about different children at different times.
Yeah, I completely agree there. I think that autonomy is going to be so important in our profession as we move forward. Another question here for you. So interested to hear your views on where teaching initial and final blends should occur in the pathway of teaching the simple to the complex code.
Do you want me to take that, or do you want to take that, Dom?
Oh, you go ahead, Charlotte.
Well, for many children, those blends, the more they practice those skills of segmenting and blending, for many children, those blends are heard naturally. They're just an extension of the listening skills that are needed to hear individual sounds in words. For some children, and I've taught children like this, they find those blends much harder to pick up. And again, that's autonomy and license to say, actually, I'm going to do some focus teaching with those children. I think as soon as they've got enough sounds, so if you look at the first, I don't know, 6 to 8 sets of sounds, SATPIN, we can start to make words like sit, we can start to make words like tap as we extend that knowledge. When we get to adding a grapheme phoneme correspondence like the ul sound and the l letter, we can add slip to that, and the children can very naturally move from hearing 3 sounds in a word to 4 sounds in a word as that arises in the teaching and learning. And that's how we set it out in the book. It's very much planned in that as soon as children have the auditory discrimination skills to do it, we bring those words in and they do it. But then it's about looking, observing, starting from the child and picking who are the children who are having those difficulties hearing that extra sound at the beginning or the end of the word, and how do we do some focused teaching with them to pick up on that.
And just to add, I firmly believe we're doing phonics for too long in a child's life. And I think and we say this in the book, it's very difficult, obviously, to put numbers on this. We do try, but to be honest, what's most important is that teachers genuinely assess children, and when they can decode well enough, that they don't need synthetic phonics. There is an issue around morphology and spelling and writing, but generally speaking, we need to get them off quicker as soon as they're ready, and that's not easy to manage practically. I appreciate that, but that's really what we need to be doing, because 2 years too long, 3 years for struggling readers. Currently, the national curriculum says struggling readers should have an extra year of phonics. Way too long. No research is showing that.
I think the difficulties always come in that move from the synthetic to the analytic, and looking at, analysing patterns in words with an investigative approach, looking at why words are formed in the way that they are. That's never been broken down well enough in any of the programmes that have come out, because we've tried to push that continuation of phonics, of synthetic phonics, rather than moving to that analytical approach.
Thank you both. We're very near the end, and I do have some closing remarks, but just very quickly, a couple of questions popping up about the term reading wars. How helpful is it? Is it a social media construct? Where is it coming from? Can you give us a very sort of brief answer on that, please?
I don't mind. I mean, yes, I think it spans from the profound to the ridiculous. So at the heart of the reading wars are people who passionately care about young children and think they have the best way to help them learn to read. And of course, we care about that. Actually, funnily enough, in the paper that Alice Bradbury and I do, we use the word reconciliation, and that wasn't quite how some of it panned out. But so I think the media have they have a responsibility, and I actually think, this. Let's go back to Told a Story. I mean, I think that influence, essentially led by one very talented journalist, is disproportionate to. Well, it's disproportionate democratically, but it's also not based out of a solid, balanced review of the evidence. And it's I heard another journalist say of that, well, it's not even investigative journalism, it's campaigning journalism. So I think the reading wars really are, a fact of educational discourse. But of course, what we have to do is maintain a very strong, rigorous grip of what actually works, and we need to resist a lot. Certainly, need to be resisting some of the politics that becomes connected to the media's perception. I should also say there's some terrific media. For example, the New Scientist. We quote the New Scientist piece that was very, very balanced. There's been pieces in the TES that have been really balanced. So you have to pick your media carefully.
Thank you, Dom. That's brilliant. I think what's really exciting is not only that we're connecting the dots for our children in a meaningful way, but crucially that we're for the first time placing a significant emphasis on understanding of children's life experiences in the context of teaching and reading and writing, including their interactions with their family, community, languages, and their motivation for reading. This is so important. And we're doing that through high quality children's literature, which increasingly represents the children who are accessing this literature. And, again, quite crucial in their learning journeys, and the fact that this is placed at the heart of their experience of teaching at school. So the double helix of reading and writing feels like a really progressive, future-facing, creative, child-centered and balanced model, and I'm really excited to see the impact in the classroom. So thank you, Charlotte and Dom, and to our audience, thank you so much for being there with us today, and we hope that you are leaving this lecture with much food for thought. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. We're off air.
Thanks, Matt. Well done. You two are